Has Britain's Prime Minister sealed the deal on Brexit? Boris Johnson is urging MPs to support his new agreement to leave the European Union at the end of the month. But will a divided Parliament give its backing? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. It's crunch time on Brexit again. With less than 2 weeks to go until the UK is due to leave the European Union, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is giving MPs a stark choice. It's my deal or no deal. He unveiled a new withdrawal agreement with EU leaders on Thursday. Now, his predecessor, Theresa May's exit plan, was defeated 3 times by unprecedented margins in Parliament. Johnson says he's confident his deal won't suffer the same fate.
This is a great deal for our country, for the UK. I also believe it's a very good deal for our friends in the EU. And what it means is that we in the UK can come out of the EU as one united kingdom. England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland together.
We have concluded the deal, and so there is not an argument for further delay. It has to be done now.
The new agreement replaces the controversial backstop in former Prime Minister Theresa May's deal, but much of the rest remains the same. The whole of the United Kingdom would leave the EU's customs union, which means it can make trade deals with other countries. But Northern Ireland will still need to follow EU rules. The customs border will be in the Irish Sea. Checks would be made at airports and seaports in Northern Ireland rather than at a land border. Northern Ireland would still have to stick to the EU single market rules, but as a get-around, the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland would both be part of what's called an all-Ireland regulatory zone. Northern Ireland's Assembly will get a vote on the changes, but that won't happen for another 5 years after the transition period is over. Well, Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, a crucial ally in Boris Johnson's minority government, says it won't support the deal.
We believe it is not in the interests of Northern Ireland, either economically, and I've explained all of that around a border essentially for not just regulations, but for goods. We have different VAT rules, and we have no effective consent over any of those rules. So all of that taken in the round means that we cannot support this deal.
Boris Johnson faces a tough job persuading enough MPs to back his deal. Rory Challens has more from London.
So Saturday is an absolutely titanic day of parliamentary business. Does Boris Johnson have the numbers to get his new deal with the EU over the line? Get Brexit done, as he puts it, and avoid having to write to the EU for that Brexit extension? Well, if he is going to do this, now that he can't rely on the votes of the DUP, the Northern Irish political party, he's going to have to count on the support of the so-called Spartans, these hardline Brexiters who have voted against deals in the past. He's going to have to rely on the support of former Tory MPs, former Conservative MPs who were thrown out of the parliamentary party for defying Downing Street in recent months. And he is going to have to rely on a number of rebel opposition MPs from the Labour Party, defying their party and coming on to the side of the deal. Crunching the numbers, it looks as if he is still perhaps about 5 to 15 votes short of that 320 vote majority that he needs to get this done. But don't underestimate the level of Brexit fatigue in this country. That might be weighing on MPs' minds. Just get this thing finished with and move on. And also don't underestimate the possibility that several MPs might change their minds at the last moment, possibly even the DUP. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Rory Challens for Inside Story.
Well, over to our panel now on this edition of Inside Story. In London, Mo Hussein, a public affairs specialist and former chief press officer to the UK Prime Minister David Cameron. In Brussels, Larissa Brunner, a policy analyst at the European Policy Centre. And also in London, Alan Wager, an associate at the research organisation UK in a Changing Europe. To all of my guests, welcome to this edition of Inside Story. I'd like to just start with the generic questions that our viewers understand where you're coming from. I mean, to be or not to be part of the EU, depending on who you ask. It's now, once again, an important question and one that will be voted on by British MPs in the coming hours. How important is it to be a Remainer, a Brexiteer or a European? Mo Hussein, let's have your initial thoughts.
I think initially now it's about being a European. I think, we had a referendum. The country has decided. I campaigned for Remain, but I was on the losing side. But I don't think leaving the EU means you're any less of a European and you can't cooperate on the big issues that face us all.
Larissa Brunner in Brussels, obviously a very different perspective from where you are.
Yeah, I agree that I think the most important thing is to be a European because even though Boris Johnson seems to go for a harder Brexit, I think it's really important to keep in mind that the trade relationship will continue in some form. The security and defence relationship will hopefully also continue in some form because that is also in the interest of the EU. So I think we should also look to the longer term and to continued good relations.
Indeed, and we will look to the long term during this conversation. Alan Wager, your thoughts about being a European, a Brexiteer and a Remainer?
Well, I think these issues have come to define British politics for the last 3 years, and regardless of what happens in the next few days, they're going to continue to define British politics for decades to come. The issue of whether the UK and the EU have a close relationship or have a much more distant relationship will not be decided by the Brexit deal voted on in the next few days. And as you say, it's going to be an existential question that's going to continue to divide British politics.
Indeed. So to a certain extent, we have to talk in hypotheticals about what might happen or what might not happen. So let's begin with what the MPs have to consider in terms of cutting their ties with the EU. Or are they still tied to the EU in terms of what the future relationship might or might not be? I mean, that will be debated in Parliament in the hours leading up to this vote on Saturday. What happens if the deal is rejected? Mo Hussein, I mean, what are the initial complications or ramifications of a vote that goes against the Prime Minister?
Well, I mean, from the government's perspective, from the Prime Minister's perspective, that would be quite a big complication because he has repeatedly said that he would not ask for an extension, which is now in law in the Benn Act that the UK Parliament has passed. So then I think we are in slightly uncharted waters. I mean, if the Prime Minister does not ask for an extension, then I think you're looking very quickly at either another legal challenge in the courts that we saw a few weeks ago, or you are looking at an election being called as a way of kind of ending this deadlock. And I think for the other parties, they will consider the next steps as well about whether they push a referendum, for example, and whether that changes any of the thinking or the numbers in Parliament. But this kind of slightly dual approach from the government saying we will obey the law and yet we will not ask for an extension has still not been really clarified. And I think that will all come to a head tomorrow.
Indeed. And in terms of whether the vote does get its approval on Saturday, Alan Wager, it's a done deal then if it gets approved. The Conservative Party and the government continue to be in charge of British government.
If the deal is approved on Saturday, as Mo says, it will be a massive win for the UK government going forward. It's still possible and indeed likely there might have to be a little bit of a further extension of Article 50 to get the deal over the line and to dot the I's and cross the T's and get the withdrawal agreement bill passed, the treaty passed. But it will be certainly a big deal for the UK government. It will be a massive vote of confidence in Boris Johnson and for Boris Johnson's approach to Brexit, and it will mean that as we go into a general election, which is likely whether the deal is passed or not, that Boris Johnson will get a significant electoral and political boost as a result. Indeed. And that's part of the reason why, in these political calculations that MPs from across the House of Commons are making, it's such a complicated decision for these MPs.
It is, and I suppose from a European perspective, Larissa, European heads of government, the bureaucrats, will either be exasperated if the vote is yet again rejected by the British parliamentarians, or breathe a huge sigh of relief that they've managed to finally find a way forward with the United Kingdom.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, for the EU, the number one priority is to ensure an orderly withdrawal and avoid a no-deal scenario. So it would definitely be a massive relief if the vote actually went through and if the withdrawal agreement was passed. If it isn't, then I think the next big question is going to be an extension. I think there is very little desire in the EU to drag out this process even further. But at the same time, the EU doesn't want to be the one responsible for triggering no deals. So even though I personally think it might be quite helpful for the UK to, in a way, for the EU to, in a way, put a gun to the UK Parliament's head and rule out any extension, so make a choose between this deal and no deal, I don't think that that's what the EU is going to do when push really comes to shove. And but the big question will be how long an extension would last. So whether it would be a rather short extension of maybe 3 or 4 weeks, just enough to organise a general election, or whether it would be a long one, maybe until next summer, and what sort of conditions would come attached.
Indeed, it's all ifs and buts at the moment until that vote happens. Hussein, you were nodding in agreement with Larissa, but can I also add to, I think most probably your agreement, is that has there been enough time to actually look at this deal that's been so hastily pushed through? While many people have compared it and said it's very close to Theresa May's deal, it is and has obviously several changes which we've mentioned at the top of this programme. Is it enough time for MPs to digest the small print?
You know, it is very similar to the deal that has already been presented to Parliament. So I think, and then if you kind of scale even further back, the referendum was 3.5 years ago, and MPs have been debating this for that amount of time. So I don't think any of the ideas in there are particularly new or will be that challenging for MPs to understand. And I think this kind of ties into the frustration that people do across the UK do feel with members of Parliament in terms of them not actually being able to agree a way forward, but actually being very good at showing what they don't agree with and what they want to oppose. And I think this is part of the thing to look out for and part of the problem for the votes on Saturday. You know, there's lots of opposition MPs and parties saying they're going to vote it down, but actually that's only half the story. What is the kind of parliamentary sweet spot almost? Where will the numbers actually agree and coalesce to show people, including our EU partners, what will get through Parliament? And when Larissa was talking about an extension, I think probably, you know, some kind of technical extension I can see happening will be quite sensible. But I think even from the EU side, giving an extension is not a blank check. You know, the EU have been marched twice up this hill now of agreeing a deal with the UK government for it to be voted down, and let's see what happens tomorrow. So I'm just not sure we can keep on going back to the drawing board without the EU getting a sense from Parliament as to what will actually work and what will get through, not just what we don't want.
Indeed, and we'll talk about that extension as well in depth a little bit later in the programme, just because I want to sort of bring in, you talked about all the hurdles that have to be jumped, and I think Larissa also is aware of these hurdles. But if I go back to Alan Wager in London, I mean, there are other elements at work at the moment. You have the SNP in Scotland tabling yet another motion within the High Courts about an immediate extension to the October 31st deadline. You've got an anti-Brexit campaigner, Joylon Morn, also in the Scottish courts, saying that the division in this deal of the Great Britain part of the deal and the separation of Northern Ireland cannot constitutionally be allowed. So you've got these under the Act of 2018, the Cross-Border Trade Act. These are still minefields for Boris Johnson because he has to keep an eye over his shoulder as to what's happening in Scotland, and certainly he knows how the politicians in Northern Ireland feel about this deal.
So it's true to say that there's divisions across the country on the deal, but I think as we get towards what is essentially a political decision, the role of the courts and the role of legal decision-making is going to have to subside. This is going to be ultimately a decision about politics, in the House of Commons. And as Mo said, people need to start making some decisions about what they want going forward. So that's why MPs hope to give Boris Johnson a clean vote on his deal tomorrow. Can he get it through Parliament or not? And then that's when other campaigners say that if it's been failed and tried and failed to get a deal through the House of Commons three and a half, 4 times really, that then other options such as a referendum can be put forward. But this is potentially Boris Johnson's one-time shot at getting a deal through the House of Commons.
So the deal scenario we've set in stone here on Inside Story. Larissa, give us a sense, really, of the political thought in Brussels and maybe with the European colleagues that you're speaking to about how exasperated or how happy or how confused they are with the way this whole Brexit process has started and may end this weekend. Because as far as Jean-Claude Juncker was concerned on Thursday, it really is the end of the road for him, because there is a new transition of senior European politicians coming to take over from the likes of Jean-Claude Juncker and his team.
Well, it may be the end of the line for Jean-Claude Juncker, but it's certainly not the end of the line for the entire Brexit process. I think quite the opposite. We're really only getting started, because let's not forget that the withdrawal agreement was supposed to be the easy bit. The much more difficult bit, the negotiations about a trade agreement and the future relationship, that's still to follow. And I think that's going to keep everyone very, very busy over the next few years. But to give you a sense, I think there is a lot of dismay and exasperation, I think, also in the EU 27. I think there is a lot of dismay about the UK's decision to leave, because it is a very important partner for all the other EU member states. It brings a lot to the table, especially in areas like security and defence. So I think it is a real loss for the EU. At the same time, I mean, of course, this process has dragged out quite a bit. I think a lot of people thought that it might go a bit more smoothly and that there would be less uncertainty also from the UK side. So I think there has been a certain exasperation about the way that the UK government has handled these negotiations, and also I think about the UK's, in a way, undecisiveness. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, dismay and exasperation mixed.
Alan, in London, in terms of the research that you do and the way that British people feel about the 2016 referendum, the 3-year process that we're sort of nearly coming to, and the way they feel about Brexit right now, what is the thought process? Because various polls give various opinions about where people stand, the way they did vote, the way they might vote, the way they could vote.
So if you ask someone on the street, do you want Brexit to be done and to be over, they're more than likely to say, absolutely, we want to get Brexit done and move on to other things. But when you dig a little bit deeper and ask, do you want your preferred outcome? Do you want your second referendum? Do you want your WTO, Brexit or whatever? People do still have really, really strong preferences and ideas about what they want. And people are still really, really divided on these Brexit options. So we see a small majority in favour of remaining in every single poll that's been conducted in the last couple of years. But again, huge divisions in the country about what Brexit should mean. So although people are exasperated by Brexit, although people sort of are a bit fatigued by the whole Brexit process, it is really defining people's politics and defining politics in Britain.
Indeed. Well, let's just give our international viewers a little bit more background to that, because, of course, the majority of Britons voted to leave the EU, as we've been discussing, in that referendum 3 years ago. 52% of voters backed to leave, 48% to remain. Polling surveys over the past month suggest that voters haven't really changed their minds. 86% would repeat their choice to leave, while the 88% who backed remain say they'd do so again. So therefore, Mo Hussein, that leads me perhaps neatly to a potential hypothetical general election. And of course, during the referendum itself, issues of immigration were high on the agenda, as were health. Those issues, I wouldn't say have disappeared, but have moved to one side, because we've had more debate on the Irish border, the backstop, trade, investment, even finance. Are we going to go back to those very hot issues that raise temperatures in and around the United Kingdom if we head to another election with Brexit as the main one and only topic of discussion for an election?
I think we will, and I think to an extent that's already happening. You know, the UK government for the last few months under Boris Johnson has been talking a lot about domestic priorities like the National Health Service, like education funding, like more police on the streets, because the people around him who are campaigners know that this is the kind of bread and butter, these are the bread and butter issues that people will vote for and people care about. So yes, Brexit, you know, will still define, but there are other things as well. And there is a sense of bandwidth being taken up by Brexit. You know, when I was in government, in the Home Office, a lot of our time was focusing on Brexit-related issues to the detriment of other things that we could have been getting on with as well. And that's the case for colleagues and former colleagues in all other government departments. So Brexit has been taking a lot of time, and that's why you keep on hearing this kind of get Brexit done mantra, so then people can focus on the other things that they want to see improved and, you know, things that affect their day-to-day life. So I think this is very much the election footing. And I also think, actually, in terms of getting the deal through on Saturday, the optics are just as important as the substance here. So, yes, the UK government and the EU have, you know, let it be known they've worked very hard to get this deal through. And I think the government definitely wants this to pass. But if it doesn't pass, it actually gives the UK government another reason to highlight Parliament's inability to actually agree or decide a way forward, and actually then push for an election again, which people in the government are not against. So it could be a kind of a win-win situation.
In terms of that word you used, I thought was very interesting, bandwidth used within the talk in government corridors. Larissa, certainly Brexit has taken up much of the bandwidth within the EU because the EU has other things to worry about, other things it wants to complete, and it has been distracted for 3 years with Brexit. If we talk about accession to the EU, there are two countries, North Macedonia, Ukraine, who want to join. Also, this talk about the European army hasn't really been discussed in depth because Brexit has taken so much more time. Leaders in Europe really do want to try and find an end game to this, don't they, so they can get on with business.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, of course, all those things you just mentioned, there has been less progress than there might have been without Brexit. There are also other challenges for the EU that really would deserve more attention than they're currently getting, like migration, the slowing economy in several countries, including Germany, and also the EU's relations with actors like the US and Turkey at the moment. So there really are a lot of issues that I think are completely overshadowed by Brexit. But at the same time, I think Brexit has also given the EU some new impetus. So, for example, on defence cooperation, it is quite, I mean, I'm not entirely sure whether the EU would have gone as far in starting a new program, a new sort of initiative to cooperate, PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, if it hadn't been for the UK's vote to leave. So it's a bit, yeah, it's not a very clear picture in this regard, but definitely Brexit is overshadowing a lot of other topics.
Indeed. Alan Wager, very briefly, but at the end of the programme, in terms of the people you're speaking to, the people that you do your research with, in terms of the, dare I say it, boredom factor, tired factor, just had enough factor, you know, the Brits at heart, you know, aren't really great people for going to vote. They don't like elections, whether it's local, national, even European. Where do you think the British people will stand when it comes to this election and this particular topic as a top electoral issue?
If Boris Johnson can get his deal through the House of Commons, then that completely changes the political picture. If he fails and he's attempted a deal and hasn't got it through, then he's hugely exposed to Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party and Jeremy Corbyn. So this vote tomorrow will come to define the electoral choice that people make in the next few months. It's going to be a really, really important vote because it provides the context about whether we have Brexit finished in some sense or whether it's still a live issue in that election. And that will completely define what happens.
Indeed, we shall see what happens in the Houses of Parliament. I think Global Eyes will be on there, certainly, on Saturday. To all of my guests, Mo, Hussein Larissa, Brunner and Alan Wager. Thanks very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story, and thank you for watching as well. Of course, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com, and for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story, and I'm also at @so_Rahman. From me and the Inside Story team, thanks very much for your time and your company.